Tennison Gambit arises from this Scandinavian defense, but in a moment, I'm going to share with you how we can use it against any opening. So here, instead of playing the expected move pawn takes d5, all of a sudden you gambit this pawn by playing knight f3. Most of your opponents will just capture these pawns off, thinking that you've removed the smooth manner free, without anticipating black's move pawn e4, and they'll happily grab the pawn. Now, you go knight g5, and you're ready to take this pawn back on the next move. Therefore, black naturally defends it. Now, you play pawn d3, and you attack this pawn for the second time. What can black do now? I mean, the most natural move to play for black would be simply to take here on d3 and secure their material advantage. Of course, there are a few other alternatives as well, but they're a lot less popular, and I'm going to share with you those lines just as well. But most of your opponents will go here, bishop takes d3. Currently, black is a pawn up, white is a bit ahead in development. This knight on g5 is particularly annoying. You know, maybe your pieces are even somewhat putting pressure here. And for that reason, most of your opponents will wish to play pawn h6, hoping that the knight will go back, and black will enjoy their extra pawn and will win the game down the road. But instead of that, all of a sudden this knight is willing to sacrifice here on f7, and that wins the game. What's the trick? Well, the knight must be captured because it's also forking the queen. And rook. After king takes, there's the killer move bishop g6, a discovered check. We're attacking here, and we're also delivering check to the king. For that reason, we're just winning the queen. And that's usually the position where chess commentators underline, saying that white wins. Although it's true, there are a few really important notes to be made here. Definitely, white has a winning advantage. We've got an extra queen, although black has two minor pieces, but that's not sufficient compensation. The king is also weak, so yeah. It is a completely winning game. But the first trick is pawn e5, and here it prepares this check bishop b4, hoping to then get back the queen. Rotates d8, and Gotham, in his video about the Tennison Gambit, said that here, in order to save the queen, you just gotta, take this pawn. And while we love Gotham in general, in this particular case, that's actually a big blunder because if you do that, then after knight c6, this queen is trapped. On the next move, knight d8 comes here to pick up the queen while white has nothing to do really. So, if white does anything, knight d8, and all of a sudden, black turns the tables and wins the game. So, that's not how you play it. Alright, going back to this position. If you ever, are in doubt about this queen, let's say black plays pawn e5 or black plays knight to c6. Which is another way for black, an even more common way, knight c6, trying to bait you into capturing this pawn, that would actually be a losing mistake. So, it's quite annoying that most players achieve this winning position, but then they spoil it right on the next move because here it transposes to the same situation. And now black wins. Basically, if you are ever in doubt about your queen, just drop it back, even all the way back to d1. Now the queen is safe, and you're winning the game. It's as simple as that. Or, if you wish to be more fancy, you can do it with a tempo. Queen d3 check, bishop f5, now queen g3 check once again. So, you're constantly delivering checks, and after that, you can castle or whatever, and, in the simplest way possible, you maintain your winning advantage. And here's some really funny stuff. Although the Tennison Gambit can be a very dangerous opening weapon in games, black's first move, pawn d5, the problem is, the Scandinavian defense is not the most popular choice for black. As you can see here, according to the stats, it's only the fourth most played move. The majority of your opponents will probably play either pawn e5 or pawn c5. So, what are you gonna do about that? Well, instead of pawn e4, you can start off the game with the move knight f3. And it kind of drags your opponent into this territory. Because now, this time, knight f3 controls the e5 square. Therefore, black can't push their pawn there or else it will be taken. And black is left with probably the main move, pawn d5. That's what your opponents will play most frequently, expecting that after pawn d4, it will transpose into the queen's gambit. But you instead play e4, and you say, hey, no, this is the Tennison Gambit. What's really annoying for black is they never intended to play this gambit. But you drag them into the same territory, so that's gonna be extremely unpleasant for black. Alright, what else can black do? Although d5 is the most played move, what else can black do? Well, the second relatively popular move is knight f6. And after that, you can still insist on playing the Tennison Gambit by playing pawn d3. That prepares the move pawn e4 on the next move, which would occupy the center. And if black goes pawn d5 here, then voila, after pawn e4, you're still switching it back to the Tennison Gambit. Black will think, hey, why not grab a pawn? They hope that you're gonna recapture, but you don't. You play knight g5 and you turn it into the Tennison Gambit. As you can see here, most of them will capture here. You take bishop d3, and most of them will play pawn h6, which loses the game after knight takes f7. And here's the funniest part. After you just played pawn to d3, as you can see, although d5 is popular, the top choice for black is pawn g6. Now, you play pawn e4, black goes pawn g7, and now you're gonna go pawn e5. And just look at this, the most played move for black is castling. Probably black pre-moved this move, castling before you played pawn e5, and so the computer automatically executes this move. I mean, that's crazy. You just win the knight for nothing, and that's the most played line. And if black moves the knight away, then, oh, okay, you just have a normal game of chess. Now, when we know how to force your opponent into the Tennison Gambit, let's also explore some sidelines so that you'll have, like, all-around knowledge and you don't just rely on a single little trick. Now here, in this position, we know that the main move is pawn takes, and you recapture. That's what multiple opponents will play. But if your opponent is a more experienced player, he or she may play bishop g4, hitting your queen. And that poses a lot of problems for white in those cases. But the move that I recommend you play is not bishop e2 or something like that, which indeed allows black to just get away with an extra pawn, but to play queen to d2. You kind of try to insist on playing the same stuff. Now, this pawn is still hanging. Therefore, at this point, black will probably capture here. Now, you recapture with the bishop, and although, you know, the position is slightly different. Funnily enough, most of your opponents will still play pawn h6. It still looks super cool for black, apart from the fact that, you know, it still ends in the same fashion. So, basically, black has to address this threat somehow. If they play pawn h6, or let's say, pawn g6, trying to fianchetto the bishop, it still fails to all the same tactics. King takes, you know, and then you're winning the queen over there. In this case, it's actually even worse for black because after queen takes d8, they can't even move this knight. Now, it's actually pinned down to the rook, so you're definitely winning here. Another way for black to try to refute the gambit would be playing bishop f5, saying, hey, I want to take here on d3. I want you to take here, and I'll trade queens and we'll get into a winning endgame. In that case, what you do is you don't take here on e4. Definitely. We're not playing the Tennison Gambit to play, you know, a worse endgame. You go knight c3, and you're willing to sacrifice this pawn because after that, all of a sudden, you've got queen f3 with multiple threats in many different directions. And this move actually confuses black a lot because they were hoping that they were almost winning the game, but now all of a sudden, there are these annoying threats, you know, to the pawn, to the rook, potentially in the future. Most of your opponents will chicken out and play bishop c8. Funnily enough, this underdevelopment, you know, is the most played move statistically, even though, of course, such a move can be really good. Now, you happily take the pawn back, and yes, you're a pawn down. But you have a huge lead in development. Basically, I would not really say that this refutes the gambit. I prefer playing this as white, especially in blitz. Here again, most of your opponents play passive moves, just trying to finish their development, pawn e6. But bishop b3, it's better to castle queenside, because the rook hits the queen potentially. Like those special pieces of navy, castle queenside, it pulls the rook opposite to the queen and creates, you know, various kinds of discovered check threats or discovered attack threats to the queen along the d-file. For that reason, black will probably play something like, you know, knight to d7, just trying to cover the queen. In this case, there is also a really good move that is worth remembering, to move queen to h3. You make it seem like you just target these pawns so that black can't castle. And while it's true, there is also a secondary threat just as well. When black plays pawn h6, trying to get rid of this annoying knight, all of a sudden, the knight changes its mind and still sacrifices itself on e6. Pawn takes, and this way we open up the king. And we'll finish off this deadly attack within just a couple of minutes. Queen takes, and there is no defense against queen to h7 checkmate on the next move. Thanks for watching and subscribe the channel.